While I was growing up, I never really liked history, and in particular Chinese history. One part was mostly because as a child, I didn't really understand the importance of understanding what caused the mistakes we made in history, and to use that as foresight to make sure we don't repeat those same mistakes again. But another part was because they were also boring and factual. I remember sitting in class and listening to the teacher drone on and on about war treaties and tax collection, and I hated every moment of it. Western history was only slightly more interesting because to me it was more exotic. And we actually went through some of the mythology surrounding the different Western countries. In Hong Kong, you're forced to take Chinese history for the first 3 years of your high school, after which you can choose to drop it or take it as an elective. And I barely scraped by with D's and E's in my Chinese history lessons, and after the mandatory 3 years of Chinese history education was over, I dropped it harder than I would a sack of bricks and never looked back since. Recently, I took a course that was about the study of children's literature, and the professor asked us about Mulan, the historical character. Most of my audience is probably more familiar with the Disney Mulan, but the Disney Mulan is actually based on an ancient Chinese story that's been told for generations called Mulan. There are some differences, but the main premise is the same. A young girl joins the army in place of her father and successfully saves China from being invaded. It was an actual thing that we had to recite during one of my years in high school, so I was rather familiar with it. Anyways, I'm not sure what led up to it, but our professor asked the class which version of Mulan we identified more with, the Disney version or the original retelling of Mulan. My answer was obvious, the Disney version, of course. My professor seemed rather shocked by this answer, and thinking back now, perhaps she thought that my having the same cultural background as the original Chinese version of Mulan would meant that I would have more of an affinity and connection to that Mulan instead of the Disney version. But that really wasn't the case for me. I hated the original retelling of Mulan. In that version, Mulan's sole identity was that of a filial daughter. The only emotion she shows throughout the entire story is that of worry and concern for her father getting drafted despite his old age. After that, she becomes a soulless and emotionless figure. She feels nothing and thinks nothing during the war. Of course, the story highlights some of the difficulties she experienced in combat, but I didn't get to experience it. The story never mentions it. Instead, it just ends with Mulan being praised as a good and heroic daughter. In contrast, the Mulan from Disney's version was a lot more relatable. We don't need to be told that Mulan's experience in the war is tough and horrible. It's common sense. We know that war is generally tough on the people who have to experience it, but in the Disney version, we actually get to see Mulan's troubles and what she feels during it. I think there's a scene in Be a Man in Disney's movie that really highlights this. There's this scene during the song where you can see Mulan is told to go home because she just can't compete physically with the other men in the army. And here lies the main difference in Disney's Mulan and its original retelling. In the original retelling, Mulan doesn't feel anything. She's just a perfect daughter who fights in a war and plays for her father. But in the Disney version, you can actually get the feeling that Mulan is reflecting on her decisions and having second thoughts about joining the war. She seems to realize that yes, there is no way for her to completely physically compete with the men in the army, and she actually considers going home. But then you see a change when Mulan thinks to herself, no, I can't give up now. I have to try at least one more time. To me, that moment of weakness is what made me root for Disney's Mulan and cheer for her when she succeeds. In Disney's version of Mulan, I actually got to see the stress and trouble she's facing, which is what gives her success later meaning to me. In contrast, I don't feel that way with the original retelling of Mulan. In fact, she almost seems like a Mary Sue to me, with how little her insecurity and hesitation is addressed in the original retelling. Such a retelling is almost insulting in a way that it's almost trying to tell the readers to be ashamed of themselves for not being as good as a daughter as Mulan. As such, the original retelling of Mulan is completely unpleasant and unrelatable to me. Looking back, I think this is the main reason why I disliked history so much. Oftentimes, I'm just made aware and forced to remember the achievements, the accomplishments, and the virtues of these historical characters, but I'm never made to be aware of them as people. The way in which history was taught to us in school has turned them into a list of actions and historical impact that they have. And that takes away everything that makes them relatable to me in the first place. Did they ever have small pet peeves that people knew about? How do they handle stress and failure? Did they have any interests or hobbies whatsoever? What are they like in their private lives? How would their friends describe them? What do they think about the people and the world that surrounds them? How am I supposed to care about these people if I'm not encouraged to see them as people? You might be looking at the title of this video and thinking, that's great and all, but where do historical characters in games come into play here? Recently, I've gotten into a rhythm game called Rhythm Star, where the goal of this game is to clear levels and to summon more heroes, which act as playable characters. The main gimmick of this game, however, is that all the heroes you can summon in the game are historical, classical composers. I can literally summon Beethoven and Mozart and Schubert and Chopin as playable characters and have them on my team in this game. They also came with these fun little bios with details that let you know a little bit about their personality and history, at least in the context of this game. This small bio alone is what sparked my interest in learning more about the actual historical counterparts of these characters. I've learned piano for a few years while I was younger, and although I knew about Mozart and Beethoven since they're pretty much common knowledge nowadays, I never really cared about them as people. However, this game alone has ignited a passion for me to actively seek out more information regarding the historical counterparts for these characters. Before Rhythm Star, I didn't know about Mozart's supposed rivalry with Salieri. I didn't know about how Liszt was a Paganini fanboy and pretty much repurposed his violin pieces for the piano and became famous because of that. I wouldn't have known that Rachmaninoff actually composed the moment's musical pieces because he got robbed and needed a way to make back the money he lost. I didn't know Haydn was such a prankster and jokester, and I wouldn't have known any of this if it weren't for this game and a small bio that made it so that these characters, to me, they feel like they're actually characters that I care about. Some people may think that it's not good to promote historical game characters when they aren't entirely accurate to their historical counterparts, but the fact remains that if it weren't for these games having these classical composers as playable characters, I would not have cared for these people. I wouldn't have even been able to see them as people in the first place. I would have only been able to see them as lists of their most famous compositions, and that doesn't invite me to care about them as people. I think that's the main problem that most people who try to teach history to other people experience. Oftentimes, we're too concerned with the facts of what has happened, or what the person did, or what effects that person's actions had on our history. But we never really focus our efforts into making these people relatable and presenting them as people. I grew up in the East, so I'm not sure if the same can be said for Western countries, but I find that this is a huge problem with how Hong Kong teaches history. They want so desperately for us to care about our country's history, yet at the same time, by treating these people as nothing more than a list of their actions and virtues, they completely dissuade us and remove our incentives for us to care about these historical characters as people. Sometimes, games that sacrifice a bit of historical accuracy can be good if it can make people relate to these characters as actual human beings. Caring about these people is what motivates us to find out more about these people and the history surrounding them. And if games with historical characters are the ones that can achieve this, then I'm glad that there are games out there that use historical characters in their games, even if they might not be entirely historically accurate at times. Regardless, this has been Ruby Canary, and I'll see you in the next video, whenever that may be. See ya!